John, hold you by phone. What's that mean?
Can we call somebody that's over there and just use like speaker to the phone or something?
Talk to it, or anything.
I mean, the other option is to log out and come back in and see.
Or we go to the office, that might work.
Yeah, you can try that. There's 9108.
Yeah, I will forward it to you.
Okay. Yeah.
If you guys want, we can go to my office, my works. The people need to grab this. No, this ours. Yeah, but seriously?
Okay, I think they should be able to hear me now. There we go. Okay, so what we know about AMH production, when we're looking at it from the follicular level, we know that AMH production declines with follicular age, which is what I just talked about. After it's recruited from the primordial pool, it starts producing in high levels and then it declines. We also know that AMH is produced in higher levels from healthy versus atretic follicles. So follicles that are producing high levels of AMH are more likely to succeed to ovulation than those follicles that are going to become atretic. And the final key that's really interesting is that AMH is directly correlated with antral follicle count, AFC, which is the total number of follicles on the ovary. And so the way this has been used thus far in the industry is producers will pull AMH on an animal to determine whether or not she will flush a lot of embryos and if it will be profitable for them to flush her and use her as an embryo donor. When we look at the course of an animal's life and trying to figure out what's going on with AMH, this is looking at AMH tracked from animals before they were bred, through calving, postpartum until about 60 days, and then again through that second gestation and post-calving again. And so we've seen from this study and several other studies have validated that AMH is consistent within an estrus cycle. It doesn't matter if you pull it during proestrus, estrus, metaestrus, diestrus, you're going to get a consistent AMH level. We've also seen when we look at gestational samples that there is a possibility to be able to use it to fetal sex animals. Remember how I talked about Sertoli cells in males producing AMH? That actually enters maternal circulation as a male fetus, and it inflates maternal AMH circulation. So when that AMH is inflated a lot, more likely she's going to be carrying a male calf. And so that's one of the ways that we can use fetal sexing with anti-Mullerian hormone. We've also seen that as lactation and age increases, anti-Mullerian hormone also increases. And we've also seen some differences with breeds, with our Bos indicus breeds having higher average anti-Mullerian hormone circulation, and Jersey breeds compared to our Holsteins also have higher AMH circulation. With all of this data, unfortunately, there really hasn't been any benchmarks set. There's a wide variation in AMH levels, and it varies from not only from animal to animal, but farm to farm, region to region. So again, that's why no benchmarks have been established. Looking at one 1,200 cow study, they found a range of about 10 to 3,000 picograms per milliliter. When they looked at that high group, the top 20%, they saw an average of 630 picograms per milliliter. But when we compare this to multiple other studies have only seen a range of up to 400. So again, this just shows the variation and the need for more research to figure out what's normal, what's not. So this is all really interesting, but how can we apply it? How can we use it? We've got to answer a couple more questions through research before we know what the applicability of this information and utilizing anti-Mullerian hormone is. And so first, we need to know what events, health events, life events, stage of life, impacts the applicability of an AMH sample. And then two, how can knowing the AMH level be used as a breeding tool? And so to answer these questions, in our study, we took a two-prong approach. The first portion was designed to follow heifers and evaluate lifetime impacts of events on circulating anti-Mullerian hormone. And the second portion was to evaluate pregnancy success of cows to different breeding protocols based on their circulating anti-Mullerian hormone. So this first portion is going to answer for us what impacts applicability. And the second portion is going to answer for us how exactly can AMH be implemented. So this is the farm that we did all of this research on. Here's just some farm stats. It is a commercial operation located in Madison, Georgia. They have a rolling herd average of just over 31,000 pounds. They're milking right about 1,100 and 100% Holsteins. They utilize both timed AI and estrus detection. Their 21-day preg rate's about 15%, feed detection rate 72, and conception rate is 32%. So for the first portion of the study, or study one, this was evaluating the impact of life events and stage of life on anti-Mullerian hormone in dairy cattle. And so the works that led us to developing this study of the project was some previous work looking at productive life in heifers. And this group found that low AMH animals have a shorter productive life, So when we look at our bottom quartile of animals based on AMH, they completed fewer lactations and had a shorter productive herd life than when you compare them with our other quartile animals. And this is showing that these animals did not last in the herd nearly as long. At the end of the trial, there was a lower percentage of animals from that low AMH group still in the herd. But these research projects have not told us what variables are at play. Why are these animals leaving the herd? Is it for reproductive reasons or what's going on? And so that's kind of the direction that we're going in. So our objectives for this study were to determine the impact of stage of life on circulating AMH levels, to establish if circulating AMH levels are impacted by life events, and to investigate the value of AMH at different time points to evaluate their change over time and their repeatability. So to accomplish this, we started with virgin Holstein heifers, 13 to 15 months old. We took an AMH sample from them and performed rectal ultrasonography. Day 0 was considered calving. At day 5 to 20, which was a fresh sample, we pulled another AMH sample. And then at day 45 to 60, a pre-breeding sample, which AMH was pulled again, and these animals were also ultrasounded. And so this was performed over about 3-4 months from December of 2017 to March of 2018. The goal was to have 100 animals. We oversampled to allow for attrition because animals did leave the herd at these different time points. Before calving, shortly after calving, and then before that pre-breeding sample was actually taken, we had heifers leaving the herd, or cows leaving the herd as well. So when we ended up with that heifer sample, after taking that heifer sample, it was taken from animals averaging 13 months old. They were estrus detected with tail shock, and they were bred by one of 2 inseminators on the farm. And their protocol was first and second service bred to sex semen, 3+ services bred to conventional semen. After breeding, these animals were pregnancy checked 32+ days later by a veterinarian, and AMH concentration, as well as age at sampling and age at first service, conception risk, and services per conception were recorded. When we go into that post-calving, the fresh sample, we had 82 animals. And again, that's because we had animals leaving the herd for a variety of reasons, and we'll get into those reasons in just a little bit. But at this 5 to 20 days in milk, we sampled again for AMH concentration. We also collected these data points, including age and days in milk at sampling, their calving date, the sex of their offspring, and the calving difficulty score, as well as any health events that occurred in their life post-calving, such as metritis, milk fever, hypocalcemia, retained placentas, anything like that. And then at our pre-breeding sample, we were down to 56 animals left from animals being culled from the herd or not conforming to the project timeline. And so we pulled AMH concentration, transrectal ultrasonography was recorded. Again, age at sampling and days in milk at sampling was recorded. And we now also add milk weights into the mix. So the 7-day average milk weight on the sampling day and on the breeding day, the day that they were bred, was recorded. So when we look at that ultrasonography data for these 2 time points, the heifer sample and the breeding sample, what we were doing was doing an antral follicle count. So counting all of the follicles that are greater than 3 millimeters. And so this is a good picture of what we were looking at. So here you can see the ovary. These are 2 follicles right here sitting side by side that are about 3 millimeters in size. This is a tougher ovary for us to count. And so this is just to show you when we get into high antral follicle count numbers, how it becomes a little bit more difficult to determine follicles from each other and to do the counting. So the procedure was to completely scan through that ovary back and forth twice to do 2 counts to ensure that we were getting an accurate count. We also recorded the number of CLs present and their cyclicity status based on the presence of CLs. And then we also did a uterine health score. So a score of 1 if they were normal or had fluid from estrus present. If they had cystic ovaries was a 2. If they had fluid from inflammation or infection, 3. Or if they had cystic ovaries and an infection, that was going to be a 4, the highest one. So this is an example of what we saw when we were looking at a normal, nice uterus. When we saw a little bit of fluid in the uterus, we see a cystic ovary. This is a 38 millimeter follicle. And then when we're looking at a uterus that has some inflammation and infection going on. For those blood samples, which were collected again at the heifer fresh and pre-breeding sampling times, Blood was collected via esophageal venipuncture into tubes containing no additives, and those samples were then immediately placed on ice, maintained on ice, and transported back to the lab for processing. So once we got back to the lab, samples were centrifuged at 3,400 RPMs for 15 minutes, and then serum was extracted from that sample and transferred into storage tubes that were labeled with animal number and sample date, and they were frozen at -20 degrees Celsius until we were ready to analyze them. For analysis, samples were shipped on dry ice to ONCH labs and analyzed using their AMH bovine assay, which has been validated for Holstein cows. That assay detects a range of 11 to just over 2,200 picograms per milliliter, utilizing 50 microliters of blood serum, and has a sensitivity of about 6 picograms per milliliter. So when we start looking at the statistical analysis of this data and we start breaking them into groups, we broke these animals into thirds, into a bottom, mid, and top third. And we did this based off of previous research, other data. We tried to find nice clean breaks that would tell you anything above this is high, anything below it is low. But again, it's just not out there because of the lack of consistency between farms and data. So multiple other projects have also done quartiles, the top and bottom 20%, and breaking animals into thirds. So that's why we chose to do this based off of previous research and based off of the distribution of the heifer AMH samples, as you can see there. So we ended up with a range from the heifer samples of 52 to 12, just over 1,200 picograms per milliliter with an average of 313. When we break that down by groups, we had 35 animals in the low group, and that was anything below 183. 36 animals in the mid group, 183 to 354. And the high group was 34 animals, anything greater than 354 picograms per milliliter. And then all of this data was analyzed using SAS 9.4 Proc-Jillian procedure. So what we end up here with, two things I want to draw your attention to. First is the antral follicle count by low, mid, and high categorization. We can see the antral follicle count was lowest for our low AMH animals, and then highest for our high AMH animals. So this validates that we did break those animals into low, mid, and high groups correctly. And then, of course, our AMH is consistent across each of these groups because that's what we broke them up by. When we look at some of those, so here's that antral follicle count just displayed as a graph. So the low had 3.51 follicles, mid 5.8, high 8.76, and all statistically significant from each other. Some other parameters that were interesting but not statistically significant. The heifer age at first service was highest for our low animals. So for whatever reason, those animals aren't getting bred as quickly as our mid and our high animals. Granted, our high animals were sampled and moved into the breeding pen just a little bit younger than our low animal group. When we look at the conception risk to first service by AMH animal, by AMH level, we can see that our low group had the lowest conception risk and that our high group had the highest conception risk, which goes along with what we're thinking that these high AMH animals are a little more fertile. And then when we look at services per conception, we can see that our low AMH animals had to be bred more times in order to achieve a pregnancy compared to our high AMH animals, which were bred fewer times to achieve a pregnancy. Looking at some of that culling data and reasons for animals leaving the herd, there wasn't anything significant, but I do think it's interesting that our low AMH animals, more of our low AMH heifers left the herd compared to our mid or our high. Moving into the fresh sample, looking at the fresh data, days in milk was not different for the groups at sampling. AMH was different, which it should be. That's what we broke the groups out by. And then the sex of the offspring and the calving difficulty score was not different for these groups. Looking at all that health data, we actually saw that there was only 10 health events. Out of 82 animals, that's an incidence rate of about 12.2%. So unfortunately, this well-managed farm just didn't have enough health events occurring for us to analyze, and there wasn't anything significant that we found here. Now transitioning and looking into that pre-breeding sample, we can see again that AMH is significant across each of the groups because that's how we broke them out by. We also see that antral follicle count numerically follows the same pattern, was not significant. And then switching, and we look at AMH over time. So again, we wanted to track what's happening to AMH level over time from the time these animals are heifers through calving and post-calving. So again, we had 105 samples at the heifer sample, 82 fresh and 56 pre-breeding. And so this is what the average anti-Mullerian hormone level, concentration was for the heifer, fresh, and pre-breeding sample. And so we can see that it dropped significantly from the heifer sample to the fresh sample. And this drop was also significant from the heifer to the pre-breeding sample. So again, here's just a graphic representation of what's happening. These guys had the highest AMH concentration. These guys had the lowest, and these guys are just a little bit in between, but not significantly different from either of these other two groups. And so when we try to look at animals' categorization over time, if they started out low, did they stay low? If they started out high, did they stay high? And so we realized that since average AMH concentration is changing from sample to sample, it's not fair to evaluate these guys and these guys based off of the heifer sample. So what we did was reevaluated based off of the distribution of AMH at each sampling point. So again, this is what we had for our heifer group as far as the low, mid, and high breakout. When we go into the breakout for our fresh group, we can see that everything dropped just a little bit. And at the pre-breeding group, we can see again that compared to the heifer group, they're dropped, but compared to the fresh group, they're a little bit higher. And so the group that's most affected, you can kind of see this high group really had a drastic drop from being more than 300 picograms per milliliter down to 172 and then 193. So what does that look like? We saw that animals from the low group, 88% of them maintained that low status from the heifer to the fresh sample, 81% from the heifer to the pre-breeding sample, and 81% kept it all the way through in all three sampling times. When we start looking at the mid group, only about 58, mid and high group, only about 58 to 60% kept that categorization from heifer to fresh. Fewer of the mid group than the high group kept that categorization to pre-breeding, and then a smaller number for the mid group kept it at all three time points. And so what we're actually seeing happening is most of these low groups kept that categorization all the way across the board. But our mid groups, what happened was most of them jumped up into the high group, and then our high group dropped down to either the low or the mid group, which I think is interesting. It's really telling us that this high group was really impacted by those health events. When we look at cows left the herd compared to our heifers, again, no significance, but we do see that same elevated number of animals leaving the herd from the low group compared to the mid and the high group. And here's just that on a graph where you can see a much higher percentage, well, about 10% higher than the mid and the high group. And so our summary of this, we see that antral follicle count is highly correlated with AMH level at the heifer sample, but not the pre-breeding sample. We did see a drop in circulating AMH from the heifer to the fresh sample before ending at that pre-breeding sample. The heifer sample was different from the fresh and the pre-breeding, but the fresh sample was not different from the pre-breeding. So there wasn't any significance there. And so this, I think, tells us that based off of all the data we saw, that our low AMH animals are a key interest. They may need special attention based on the fact that they did have a higher age at first service, higher services per pregnancy, and a lower conception risk to that first service breeding. So switching gears a little bit, going into the second study that we had, study 2 was evaluating anti-Mullerian hormone as a reproductive tool in lactating dairy cows. This was based on research from previous works. This one project in particular looked at about 1,200 cows that were synchronized and bred to timed AI, and that was followed by heat detection 19 to 35 days later before they were placed with a bull. These animals were broken into a top 20% by AMH and a bottom 20% by AMH. Our low AMH animals, we saw, had a greater pregnancy loss between days 30 and 65 of gestation throughout the whole trial. And at the end of the season, more of our high AMH animals were pregnant than our low AMH animals. One thing that is interesting to note, though, animals that were bred to this timed AI protocol, the low AMH animals exhibited estrus more than the high AMH animals. And the reason the authors theorize is that it's a result of the timed AI protocol pretty much forcing follicular development and optimizing ovarian performance, forcing follicular development, luteal regression, and ovulation by putting those animals on that protocol. So all of this data is pretty interesting. It lends us to believe that there may be differences in how we can treat low AMH and high AMH animals by breeding protocol. So that's how we took on and began designing this study. And so the objectives of this study were to determine the impact of circulating AMH level on the ability to obtain a pregnancy, to investigate whether high and low AMH animals respond differently to a timed AI versus an estrus detection protocol, and finally, to characterize the ability to predict success of an animal on a breeding protocol by their AMH level. So the timeline for this project, day 0 was considered calving. At day 45 to 60, the pre-breeding sample was taken, which was our AMH sample and ultrasound collection. There was then a breeding window post this pre-breeding sample, and then 32 plus days post-breeding, these animals were pregnancy checked. So we had 315 animals that we ended up with at that pre-breeding sample. These animals were enrolled on a rolling basis. Again, they were AMH concentration was pulled and transrectal ultrasonography was performed as previously described in the heifer study. The data points that were collected were age at sampling, days in milk at sampling, as well as the 7-day average milk weight for the day that they were sampled and the day that they were bred. When we get into breeding protocol assignment, animals were randomly assigned to one of 4 breeding protocols, all with estrus detection. And so the idea was we really just wanted to compare timed AI versus estrus detection and high versus low animals, and put that into a 2x2 factorial to be able to compare those parameters. However, when we started looking into what breeding protocols we were looking at, we had 2 different estrus detection protocols. One that's natural, so a natural estrus detection after that animal came into heat. And then the second was an induced protocol. So animals that were bred following estrus detection because of a prostaglandin injection. And these are not comparable to each other. So having that prostaglandin injection could be forcing ovulation in that animal and could be remedying any issues if she was not cycling, getting rid of a luteal cyst or something like that. And so we really can't compare those two. And then we saw the same thing when we started looking at our timed AI protocols. So comparing a double off-sync to an off-sync protocol, there was a difference in days in milk at first service. And we didn't want to allow that to skew our data. So animals that are bred later days in milk, they've had more time to resume cyclicity post-calving and post all of the stressors of calving. And so that could artificially affect our data. And so just to make sure that we weren't letting any of that happen, we came up with this protocol, which is going to be analyzing all the animals based off of all those different breeding protocols that we talked about. So when we looked at these animals were bred between 53 and 115 days in milk. First service averaged 82 days in milk, and animals were confirmed pregnant 32 plus days post-breeding. We actually sampled 652 cows. It was a lot, sampling a lot of cows in order to try to get these numbers nice and even in these categories. And that's due a lot to culling from the herd. Because it is a commercial operation, not a research farm, we can't ask them to keep all the cows for us. So we did end up with some attrition of animals, and that's why we, sampling the 652 animals, we ended up with groupings of 71 animals in the natural, 70 on the induced heat, 27 on the double off-sync, and then 85 on the off-sync protocol. The ultrasound data that was collected at the pre-breeding sample, as well as the blood that was collected at the pre-breeding sample, was processed, handled, stored exactly the same as the parameters that were described in the heifer study. When we get into the statistical analysis, again, we broke these animals into thirds based off of this distribution here, as well as the previous research that I described earlier. And so we had a range of about 28 to almost 1,300 picograms per milliliter, an average of 244. When we look at the low, mid, and high group, our low group had 105 animals, and it was anything less than 158 picograms per milliliter. The mid group was 158 to 275, and our high group was anything greater than 276 picograms per milliliter. All of this data was then analyzed using SAS 9.4 Procter-Line procedure, the same as the heifer study. So I'm going to walk you through this and point out some particular interesting results. First off, I do want to say, just like the heifer study, we do see the antral follicle count was significant between the low, mid, and high group, lowest for the low group, highest for the high group. So that tells us, again, it validates the way that we broke these animals into low, mid, and high. The next thing is looking at lactation number and age at sampling. We did see that lactation number and age at sampling was greatest for our high group, which I think is interesting, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. The age and lactation number were highly correlated, so it should make sense if one of them is impacted by AMH level, the other one will be as well. When we look at these, the 7-day milk weight on the sampling day, we also see that our high group had a higher milk weight compared to our mid and our low group, and that should make sense because our high group animals are also our older animals and our higher lactation number animals. Looking at our breeding protocols by AMH level, there really wasn't anything significant at all up here, but when we get down to that OBSYNC, we do see that more animals from the mid group were bred to OBSYNC compared to the low group, which I think is interesting. Our first service conception risk was also different between the groups numerically. So our low AMH group had the lowest first service conception risk, high AMH group had the highest conception risk. And then this not bred right here is any animals that didn't conform to the study timeline or were culled. So this number being higher than the other two, it's not a true representation of animals that were not bred for any particular reason. So again, just looking at that lactation number by AMH group, we can see that our low group were lower lactation number animals, mid and high was higher lactation number animals. Looking at that milk weight follows the trend, so our low lactation number and our low AMH animals also had a lower milk weight compared to our mid and our high AMH groups. And then looking at that conception risk for first service, so our low animals had that lowest conception risk compared to our mid and our high animals, even though it wasn't statistically different. So when we look at these results broken out by breeding protocol now, not by AMH level, we're looking at natural versus induced versus the double OBSYNC versus the OBSYNC protocol. And so we see first, I think it's interesting that by lactation number and age at sampling, more of our older animals were bred on the natural and the induced protocol. When we switch and look at our antral follicle count, we can see the antral follicle count was highest for our OBSYNC group, and it was lowest for our double OB and our induced group. Looking at the percentage of animals cycling, it was greatest for animals that were bred on the natural or induced group versus the time-day I groups, and that should make sense. If there's a higher proportion of them cycling, they're more likely to exhibit estrus, come into estrus, ovulate, show heats, compared to our animals that fewer of them were cycling. So they would roll onto one of those breeding protocols, the time-day I breeding protocols. Looking at days in milk at first service, so we do see that days in milk at first service was lowest for our natural and our OBSYNC animals, higher for the induced and double OBSYNC animals. And then looking at our milk weights together, we do see that our milk weights were highest for our natural and our induced group, and that should make sense. That we just talked earlier about how that natural and induced group was mostly higher lactation number, older animals. And something else that's interesting to note, I think, is that we talked about AMH level as well as milk production and age, and so this kind of is following along in suit. This one in particular is the highest. This guy is the next to next highest. But it's making sense. The pieces are fitting together that these animals have the highest milk production because they are our oldest animals and our higher lactation number animals. So again, looking at lactation number by breeding, we saw more of our double OB animals were our lower lactation number animals compared to our natural and our induced groups. We also see the antral follicle count was highest for that OBSYNC group and lowest for the induced and the double OBSYNC group. And then when we look at those milk weights by breeding protocol, so this is looking at the sampling day as well as the breeding day milk weight, it was highest for that natural and induced group for the reasons we just talked about. When we break this out, looking at it by lactation number, we can see that the age at sampling and the days in milk at sampling was different. So age at sampling should make sense because our higher lactation number animals are older. Days in milk at sampling, it was significant, but again, it's a very small window. It was only 45 to 60 days. And so there's really only a difference of about 2 days between these guys. So it's not something that really plays a role or that we're going to dive into much further. Something that was interesting to look at, the number of CLs present and the percentage of animals cycling. So we can see that our first lactation animals, a much smaller percentage of them were cycling when we compare that with our lactation 2, 3, and 4 plus animals. You see the same, a similar trend with anti-Mullerian hormone. So these guys, our first lactation animals also have a lower anti-Mullerian hormone level than our lactation 2, 3, and 4 plus, which confirms previous research which says that anti-Mullerian hormone level or concentration increases with age and lactation number. And then finally, when we look down here at our milk weights, we can also see that our milk weights increase by lactation, which they should. And so pulling this out just to look at a little bit more, because I think it's interesting, the number of CLs present and the percentage of animals cycling, this may lead you to believe, okay, something's going on with these first lactation animals. Why are they not cycling? Are they having a harder transition? What's going on? And so again, I mean, you pull it out and you look at it, and it's different. It's very different for our first lactation animals from the rest of the herd. But then when we start looking at factors like first service conception risk and days in milk at first service, it's not different. It's not different for our first lactation animals compared to our second lactation, third lactation, and 4 plus animals. If those were different, we may think that, yes, there is something going on, something's going on with these first lactation animals, whether they're having a hard transition or what. But since these aren't different, it's probably just an anomaly that's going on, why those first lactation animals are not cycling. Looking a little bit higher up, looking at some of these breeding protocols, we can see that for our natural and induced breeding protocols, that more of our higher number of lactation animals were bred on that protocol, and that's the same thing that we saw earlier, breaking this out by breeding protocol. You can see there. And so the thought that we're going for is that our high, and that is confirmed by this and the previous data that we've seen from this study, is that our higher lactation animals have a higher anti-Mullerian hormone concentration, as well as a higher antral follicle count. So again, looking at that circulating AMH by concentration, lower for our first lactation compared to our 2, 3, and 4 plus lactation animals. When we start breaking this out by outcome, so comparing the animals that were open and the animals that were pregnant to the protocols, and kind of diving a little bit deeper into some of these parameters, we can see that AMH was different for these guys, and it falls in line. That AMH for our open animals was lower than the AMH concentration for our pregnant animals. Likewise, it's also interesting to note that the milk weight at the sampling and the breeding day was higher for our open animals than our pregnant animals. And so this is a little bit contradictory from what we just talked about, because we just learned from other data that high AMH equals high milk production. So here's kind of the mechanism or thought that we think is going on and playing a role. So again, we just talked about how high milk production means we're going to have a higher antral follicle count and higher anti-Mullerian hormone circulation. And overall, we're thinking that leads to increased fertility. But we also know from the very beginning of this presentation that higher milk production also causes increased metabolism of estrogen and progesterone from circulation, and that those have negative effects. They reduce fertility. They cause embryonic death, failure to ovulate, as well as allowing poor quality oocytes to grow. And so something's just not adding up here. This is supposed to equal increased fertility and reduced fertility. And the reason is that we don't know to what degree these are reducing fertility and this is increasing fertility. We don't know how these are interacting with each other, which one plays a larger role than the other one, and how they actually impact and what that final fertility level for this animal is going to be. So when we break it out and look at the percent pregnant by breeding protocol, we can see that more of our pregnant animals were bred on the induced protocol, about the same number on the natural and the double off-sync, and the lowest number was the off-sync protocol, but it was not significant. So summarizing all of this, putting it all together, looking at the variables that were impacted by AMH level, we saw that there was a positive correlation between lactation number, age, as well as antral follicle count and AMH level. We saw that by breeding protocol, as AMH, higher AMH level, we saw that more animals were bred on the off-sync. For our 7-day milk weight, for the sampling day, higher AMH level also meant we were going to see a higher milk weight there. Switching gears, and we start talking about variables that were impacted by lactation number that we've looked at. So age and days in milk increased with lactation number. Antral follicle count, circulating AMH, and AMH level increased with lactation number, as well as the number of CLs and the percentage of animal cycling increasing. And finally, the 7-day average milk weight for sampling and breeding day increased with lactation number, which again should make sense. Our higher lactation animals, they're producing more milk. And then our breeding protocol, we saw that by lactation number, more of our natural and induced animals were bred. More animals were bred on the natural and the induced protocol for some of the reasons that we talked about earlier. We start looking at the variables that were impacted by protocol. We did see that antral follicle count was greatest for our off-sync group, followed by the natural, then the induced, then the double off group. We saw that days in milk at first service was greatest for our induced and our double off group. We also saw that our 7-day average milk weight for sampling and breeding days followed the same trend. It was greatest for the double off group, then the off-sync, then the natural, and then the induced group. And so variables that impacted our first service outcomes, so whether or not those animals were pregnant or open, milk weight was one of those factors. So milk weight was greater for our open animals than our pregnant animals. And so kind of bringing it all back to what our objectives for this study were. First objective was to figure out, is there an impact of stage of life on circulating AMH? And the answer is yes, we saw that. We saw that heifers have higher AMH levels than cows. So yes, there is an impact of stage of life. Is circulating AMH level impacted by life events? Yes, we saw that post-calving, the act of calving, depresses AMH level. And then finally, what happens to AMH over time and its repeatability? We saw that AMH declined from heifer to lactating cow, but we also saw that most of our low AMH animals maintained that categorization. Some of our mid and high animals flip-flopped, but overall we saw most of those low animals maintaining that AMH categorization. So the repeatability of it is higher with our low AMH animals compared with our mid and our high animals. We'll look at the objectives for the cow study. First one, is there an impact on circulating AMH level and the ability to obtain a pregnancy? For us in this study, no, there was no impact of AMH on first service conception risk. Do high and low AMH animals respond differently to timed AI versus heat detection protocols? No, there was no difference between first service conception risk and breeding protocol. And then finally, can we predict the success of an animal on a breeding protocol by AMH level? And again, no, there was no difference between first service conception risk by breeding protocol and AMH. However, there was some really interesting numerical differences, even though they were not statistically significant. And so moving forward with this, how is this applicable? Taking all of everything that we've just learned. So we have validated what other researchers have said, which is that AMH is a reliable predictor or an indicator of antral follicle count of an animal. However, some life events negatively impact circulating AMH. So if a producer wanted to utilize AMH as a predictor of antral follicle count, they would need to be aware of these life events to ensure that they're pulling a reliable sample. They're not pulling a sample immediately post-calving, which may be artificially depressed, and then deciding that that animal's low AMH and culling them from the herd, when it may just be artificial depression because of these life events. We also see, based on some of our numerical data, that AMH could be used to select for more fertile animals by identifying those low AMH animals. Those low AMH animals had that lower conception risk and higher services per conception. They had that higher age at first service. And the differences in animals, percentage of animals that were cycling based on CL presence, indicates that our low AMH animals are really the group that we could be targeting. From this research, we did find that there's really not any definitive data on breeding protocols for high versus low AMH animals and how they perform. More research for sure is necessary in each of these categories. And so the applicability of some of this right here is definitely pending more research. And so in future research, I'd like to see a larger sampling size. So this study ran from December of 2017 to March 2019. We sampled more than 750 animals total in order to come up with the different animal groupings that we had. And so if this study were completed on maybe a research operation in which animals weren't leaving the herd or for voluntary reasons, we might be able to glean out some of these numerical differences and see some statistical significance in those numerical differences. We also saw, because it was such a well-managed herd, that our calving difficulty scores and our health event scores and reporting of those, we just didn't have high enough numbers. So we want to do this on another operation, not necessarily an operation that has poor management and more of these happening, but just a larger sampling size so we could get some more health events happening. And again, having this larger sampling size may give us significant results on some of the parameters that were just numerically different. And so something else I'd like to see, our animals were not stratified by lactation number, and so we did see some interesting differences with lactation number and the breeding protocol that they were on. And so I'd like to see an equal number of animals from each lactation number on these different breeding protocols to kind of tease out some of the variability and interesting things that we saw there. And so finally, I would like to thank Major Professor Dr. Jillian Bohlen, as well as committee members Dr. Graves and Dr. Palomares, statisticians Dr. Ely, as well as Andra Nelson, the undergraduate researchers who helped me collect the data, as well as everyone at the commercial farm, particularly Kyler and Dave, who helped a lot, as well as the Southeast Milk Checkoff for making this project able to happen. And so here is all of the literature cited, and finally, I would like to take any questions that you have. Questions for you? Yeah.
In the heifer study, when you had the changes over time, when you lost animals, were the values only the 56 animals that made it all the way through?
Yes. Yeah, so when we were looking at, because remember there was the 3 sampling times, the heifer and then the heifer to fresh. So the heifer to fresh was only for the animals that made it to the fresh sample, so the 82 animals. And then heifer fresh to the pre-breeding sample was, like you said, only for those animals that, the 56 that remained through all 3 of those sampling times.
The other question I had was, what's the biological function?
That's a good question. So AMH, we've seen actually plays an interaction with other hormones in the body. That part of it we're not too sure on. The main part that we see is AMH has an inhibitory action on other follicles. So after follicles are recruited from the follicular pool and they begin producing AMH, we see that AMH acts negatively on the follicular pool to prevent other follicles from being selected.
Also, some of the production results increases with the low beta hybrids. Is there any selection protocol, would you say some of this genetic for breeding with higher AMH values?
So some of it, yes, for sure, is genetic. We have seen that AMH is lowly heritable, so that could be a factor for producers when they're selecting animals. But a lot of it, I think there is an environmental role that's taking place. And so further research, I didn't mention it here, but there's also been some research to show that like the heritability that I was talking about, it's highly correlated between dam and daughter. So AMH in that daughter, if the mom had higher AMH, that daughter is going to have higher AMH generally regarding some other environmental factors. So to answer your question, there is some thought that you can utilize it to select as a selection tool and to select animals based on that, but there's still just not a whole lot of data. There's only a couple studies on that actually performed yet.
Here or we deliver it here?
If you have any general.
All right. So,
More stressful for her, right?
Awesome.
No, this is a general question. First, I want to congratulate you. I think it was an excellent presentation. You're making a good point, and it's establishing the baselines for anti-Mullerian hormone and how it changes, with the reproductive life. And I think there are so many gaps when you start studying, anti-Mullerian hormone is like you end with the literature and you still feel that you're lost. Mm-hmm. So, it's like your question, what is the function? So nobody has established, and I have a general question. You establish, you discriminate or establish your groups, low, medium, and high, based on the thirds, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm just thinking about the possibility of running against stat analysis, and probably the results will be the same, but applying, for example, a discriminatory analysis that can by itself, by the variability of the data, the software might help to decide which are the cutoff. Maybe there is a statistician here and can, explain or giving us more details about it. But I have had the same doubts with data, like trying to establish what is low, medium, and high based on how the data looks by itself. But I know that there are more objective analyses that can help, telling us what are the cutoffs based on the variability itself. So I may be running that again, and maybe the results will be the same.
Yeah, and so that's actually something that I did talk with the statisticians about after we got some of these preliminary results in, and we're going to kind of play with those numbers, the thresholds where that low-mid cutoff point and where's that mid-high cutoff point is, kind of artificially move those around and see what happens with our results, see if we get anything that's not significant. So that's something we're going to be working on here shortly.
And I have another question here. Well, I'm very glad that you mentioned about non-statistical significance, even there is apparently a biological effect that we can see numerically different but not statistical. So I think that's important to make the point, because even you have a p-value that was 0.13, it's suggestive of something.
Yeah.
And the other was about the CL numbers that you use, and I wanted just to clarify that, or for you please to clarify that about the CL numbers, since I see more that variable as a categorical variable. It might be like an ordinal non-parametric variable, since it's like a cow might have 1 CL, might have 2 CLs, might have no CL, or but a cow with a 0.5 CL is not making other,
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean, and again, that's something that we want to look into. We started doing that just to see, and basically, yeah, a 0.5 CL is, you're right, it's not really anything significant. But by comparing that with our other groups that may have 1.5 CL, it's just telling, I think it's telling us that that number is inflated. The percentage of animals in that group that have CLs is greater. And so we did that mostly because we were seeing a larger proportion when we were collecting data of animals that were first lactation that did not have any CLs. And so we thought that was interesting and might be significant. We also saw some cases of double ovulation, which isn't in this data, but will be in future data that we'd like to kind of tease out.
Like showing the tendency, like an average of the group. But it could be interesting if you calculate the proportion of animals with 1 CL, proportion animal with 2 cells or
Yeah.
no cells within each group.
Yeah, for sure. That would be really interesting.
Any other questions for Kayla? All right, thank you again.
Thank you.
Right?
Do I?
So when did you take your last samples? 2 weeks ago?
No, it was March. Early March.
I thought you had some samples.
Oh, single sending off.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the last.
When did you get your last result? 2 weeks ago?
I just didn't want to go in there.
It was just 2 weeks ago. I don't know. It's all like that.
I really enjoy it.
Oh, good, I'm glad.
I'll be right back.
Great. This will be at your desk. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you have a lot of things. No, but it's really cool. I need to send you our abstract. We sent to the FT, will be presented in Savannah this year. Comparing beef versus dairy. We run our Anti-Mullerian and yeah, it's really confusing. You know, our data, we saw that and we see a tendency. Actually, we see beef higher anti-Mullerian hormone.
Yeah.
Might be related with leptin, with body condition.